Hey everyone, Seth here from Theology with Seth, and today we're going to be talking about millennial views. Now this, if you didn't know, is a controversial subject. Christians debate this issue all the time. I myself have taken some pretty intense heat for what I believe about this subject, and maybe you have too, but no study of the end times would be complete without addressing it. And so in this video, I'll be explaining what the millennium is. We'll look at the three main schools of thought on it, and if you're interested, at the end, I'll share my own perspective with you. Now, if you're new to this subject, you might be wondering, Seth, what the heck is a millennial view? What are you even talking about? Well, let's get into it. Think about the major end times events that we've talked about on this channel. We've talked about the second coming of Christ in Revelation 19:11 through 21. We've talked about the final judgment in Revelation 20:11 through 15. And we've even talked about the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21 through the end of the book. And that's pretty much it, right? Wrong. I don't know if you noticed, but there are actually some verses in there that are unaccounted for, namely the first half of Revelation 20. As it turns out, there's an entire story tucked away in there that we haven't even talked about yet. It's a story that mentions this period of 1,000 years, or what we would call the Millennium. So we're about to just read this passage together, and I'd like for you to really try and visualize what John is seeing here. So this is Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, and in the book, it's written after the second coming of Christ. And here's what we read. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. And here's what happens next. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Now, real quick side note, pretty much every commentator agrees that when John says the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended, that is actually a parenthetical comment, meaning it's kind of like a side note, if you would. And so when John says this is the first resurrection, he's actually referring back to the Christians who came to life and reigned with Christ. So hopefully that'll help you make some sense as we go along. And then it continues, Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And then this is how the passage ends. And when the 1,000 years were ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So, what is going on in this passage? It might not seem like it at first, but this passage ignites endless debates in Christianity. But what I want to actually start with is what we agree on. What are some basic observations from this passage that all Christians believe? Well, number one, the millennium is a long but limited time period. Now that's important because regardless of what your interpretation is, the millennium is not forever. It's only 1,000 years, or whatever time period 1,000 years would symbolize. So it's a long but limited time period when the activity of Satan is significantly restrained. That's how the passage begins. It says Satan was bound. And then it's when believers live and reign somewhere with Christ, in some sense. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then it ends with Satan's release and one final rebellion. And then here's what I really want to emphasize. When all is said and done, the dead will be judged, Christians will be raised immortal, and we will live on a renewed earth with Christ reigning as king. I think that's really important to keep in mind as we examine the various interpretations of this passage. All the major schools of thought ultimately lead to the same endpoint. They just disagree on some of the details that happen along the way. And so if you end up being wrong about your interpretation of the millennium, it's not the end of the world, so to speak, because we all agree on the final outcome of things in the end. And so with that foundation in place, what are some of the things we disagree on? Well, there's quite a few. In fact, one writer said, the millennium is 1,000 years of peace that Christians like to fight about. And that is so true because there's a lot of disagreements we have. For one, does the millennium begin before or after Jesus returns? It's written after Jesus returns in the book of Revelation, but how do we know those visions are in chronological order? It could be a flashback. We'll look at that later. Second, does it take place on earth or in heaven? Some of the elements in that passage look very earthly and some of them look very heavenly. Third, is Satan's restraint complete or only partial? Are the two resurrections mentioned in that passage physical, spiritual, or perhaps one of each? And is the final battle the same one that we saw in chapter 19 where Christ returns? Or is it a second battle 1,000 years later? So here's the deal. All of these are great questions, and how you answer them will place you into three broad schools of thought. I'm going to take you through them from the simplest to the most complex. And in this particular video, I'm not going to argue for or against any of them. We'll do that in the next couple of videos. But in this video, I just want to present them to you so that you can get a lay of the land and see what the options are. Okay, so the first major school of thought is called Amillennialism. Now, it should be admitted at the start that Amillennialism is not the best name for this view, because when you put the letter A in front of a word, it negates it. So if you're an atheist, that means you don't believe in God, or if something is atypical, that means it's not typical. So the word amillennialism literally means no millennium. But that's not really fair to say because amillennialists have Revelation 20 in their Bibles too. They do believe in a millennium. Rather, what this term means is that there's no future millennium on earth. According to this view, the millennium is primarily realized in heaven. And this is important. It began during Jesus' first coming and ends with his second coming. In other words, the millennium is happening right now. It's overlapping with what we would call the church age, or if you want to impress your friends, you can call it the inter-advent age. Now, right off the bat, I imagine some people are saying, well, Seth, that can't be right because more than 1,000 years have happened since his first coming. Well, according to Amillennialism, the 1,000 years is actually a symbolic number. It's not a literal 1,000 years. It just means a long period of time. And here's how it works. Christians who die go to reign with Christ in heaven today. So in a previous video of mine, we talked about how when Christians die, their souls immediately go up into heaven to be with Christ. And we referred to that as the intermediate state. Well, according to this viewpoint, the intermediate state for believers and the millennial reign of Christ are really kind of the same thing. And so when a Christian passes away, their soul goes to heaven and they reign with Christ in millennial glory. And that takes place throughout the duration of the church age. And what effect does this have for people on earth? Well, Satan is bound so that he cannot prevent the spread of the gospel. Now, me personally, I'm kind of a visual learner, so let's put this on a timeline. So we'll start with Jesus' crucifixion, which happened about 2,000 years ago, and somewhere around that time, Satan was bound, and that launched the millennium. And the millennium takes place concurrently with the church age. It's happening right now. And throughout the church age, as Christians pass away, they go to heaven to reign with Christ. But then at the end of the millennium, which is the end of the church age, Satan is released, and he launches one final rebellion. And in amillennialism, that's typically referred to as the Battle of Armageddon. But it's quickly defeated by Jesus' return. And then after that, we have what's called the general resurrection. I call it the general resurrection because they believe that believers and unbelievers will be raised at the same time on the same day when Jesus comes back at the end of the millennium. And then right after that, we have the final judgment, and then we enter into the eternal state. We defined all these terms in my last video, but the eternal state basically refers to the new creation, the place where believers will spend eternity. And so you can see how in amillennialism, as soon as Jesus comes back, all the major end-time events that we looked at in my last video basically happen immediately. And then I thought it would be fun to do a fun fact about all these views. So, fun fact about amillennialism, it's the dominant view among Reformed theologians. And that's actually really surprising if you think about it, because amillennialism is also more or less the official eschatology of the Roman Catholic Church. And so you would think the reformers would have wanted to get as far away from it as possible, but surprisingly they didn't. They preserved it, and amillennialism has had a strong history in the Reformed tradition even to this day. The next view we're going to look at is called Postmillennialism, and this view teaches that Jesus comes back after the millennium. That's what post means. Now, technically speaking, even amillennialism teaches that Jesus comes back after the millennium, but postmillennialism is very different. According to this view, the millennium begins with the success of the Great Commission, resulting in a golden age of spiritual prosperity on earth. So in this view, the millennium takes place on earth, not so much in heaven. As the gospel goes forth, the nations will progressively submit to Christ. And as they do so, Christian principles will dominate every aspect of society, and most people in the world will convert. So just think about how much better the world would be if all the governments ruled according to Christian principles, and if biblical values dominated arts and entertainment. Think about how wonderful it would be if most of the world were true Bible-believing Christians. Well, that's what postmillennialists are looking forward to and working towards, and they believe that that will be the last chapter of church history before Christ comes back. In fact, one thing that postmillennialists often say is that Christ returns to a Christianized world. Now, at the tail end of that millennium, though, there's a brief, negligible rebellion which Christ defeats with his second coming. And so even in postmillennialism, not every single person on earth gets converted. There's still going to be a small minority of unbelievers. And they do launch some sort of rebellion, but it's hardly worth mentioning. It's over really quickly. Jesus defeats it with his second coming, and that's the end of that. And so let's put this on a timeline as well. So Jesus' crucifixion was 2,000 years ago. Right now we're in the church age. And at some point, the Great Commission is complete, and Satan is bound. He can't deceive the nations anymore because the nations have been converted. And then we enter into this golden age of 1,000 years on earth where knowledge of the Lord covers the earth as waters cover the seas. And then at the end, Satan gets released. He launches this final small rebellion, but it is quickly defeated by Jesus' return. And at that point, it kind of picks up where amillennialism left off. There's the general resurrection, and then the final judgment, and the eternal state, all of which happen kind of in one fell swoop in postmillennialism. And fun fact about this view, this was the dominant view among the Puritans. And you can see why. The Puritans came to America from England, and they had a whole new world ahead of them. And they put churches everywhere. They had Bible-believing pastors everywhere. And for them, Christian principles really did dominate society. So you can see how they really thought that this golden age was unfolding right before them. But then we had all the disasters of the 19th and 20th centuries, and postmillennialism really fell out of favor, and it's never really come back since. There are still a few ministries today that are trying to keep it alive, but by and large, postmillennialism is considered a minority view today. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. So keep that in mind as well. And so finally, the next big school of thought is called Premillennialism. Now, what do you think that view teaches? Yes, exactly. It teaches that Jesus comes back before the millennium. Pre means before. And so according to this view, the millennium begins with a complete removal of satanic influence from the earth. And so when Jesus returns, he banishes Satan from earth, and probably all his demons as well. And he throws them into the bottomless pit so that they have no more influence. He can't tempt people during this time. He can't persecute people during this time. He is utterly incarcerated. And then Christians from all history are resurrected and reign with Christ on earth. And now here is the most difficult thing to conceptualize about premillennialism. It's that non-Christians will not be resurrected until the end of the millennium, but many live on earth prior to that. So here's the deal. When Christ comes back, not every unbeliever will be wiped out. Some of them will continue to live on. They'll have children, and then their parents will die, and then they will have children, and their parents will die, and they'll continue to procreate. But they're doing so alongside of Christians who have been raised from the dead and are in glorified, immortal bodies, never to die again. And so you have two very different categories of people coexisting on earth at the same time. Glorified, immortal Christians and unglorified, mortal, non-Christians intermingling on earth during this 1,000 years. So it's a very interesting combination of elements, and if this view is true, then the millennium will be a very unique chapter of human history, unlike anything that we've ever seen before. Now, here's how this view plays out. A lot of the non-Christians, they submit to Christ outwardly because they have to, but inwardly, they're not a big fan. They don't actually love Jesus, and they're secretly looking forward to any opportunity to rebel against him. And at the end of this 1,000 years, they get their opportunity. Because at the end, Satan is released and persuades the non-Christians to rebel against Christ. He goes up to them and says, hey, if you follow me, we can turn this thing around. We can beat Christ. And so they give it their all, but they are finally defeated. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes them, and that's it. And then at the end of that, all non-Christians from all history are raised, and we face final judgment. So let's put this on a timeline. Starting with Jesus' crucifixion, we're currently in the church age. And then I should probably also mention that most premillennialists are pretty insistent that the world will get progressively worse as we near the second coming of Christ. And that period of difficulty is usually referred to as the tribulation. But then at the end of that tribulation, Jesus returns, Satan is bound, and Christians are raised from the dead. And then we live and reign with Christ for the entire millennium on earth. But then at the end, Satan is released, and he goes up to all the non-Christians who have been living on earth, and he persuades them to follow him, and then they launch the very last battle in all of human history. But they're decisively defeated, Satan is thrown into the lake of fire, and then we have the resurrection of all non-Christians from all history. And then we face final judgment, and the eternal state happens after that. And so that's the essence of premillennialism. And fun fact about this view, it's the oldest eschatology in the church. This view actually goes way back. In fact, the ink had hardly even dried on the New Testament, and you can already see Christian heavyweights preaching premillennialism. So it's very old, but there's something we need to talk about. And that's that about 200 years ago, there was a split in premillennial thought. So historically, premillennialists understood that there was a rapture of believers at the end of the tribulation. We made a whole video about this subject, but basically, premillennialists believe that the rapture and Jesus' return were really one and the same event. They happened at the same time. But about 200 years ago, there was another group of people that emerged who argued that actually the rapture has to be before the tribulation. And this school of thought differed with the standard version of premillennialism in several important ways. For one, they drew a really sharp distinction between ethnic Israel and the New Testament church, saying that these were two separate entities and God had separate plans and separate purposes with both. They taught that the temple in Jerusalem would be physically rebuilt and that animal sacrifices would be reinstituted throughout the duration of the millennium. And this movement became known as dispensationalism, and their version of premillennialism became known as dispensational premillennialism. Or sometimes it's called pre-tribulational premillennialism, since it believes that the rapture happens before the tribulation. And this view is still around today. In fact, it's probably the most popular view for evangelicals in America. My fun fact about it is that it's the most commonly depicted scenario in pop culture. If you watch a movie or read a book dramatizing the events of the end times, I can pretty much guarantee you it's going to be from a dispensational premillennial perspective. But then in response to this, the older premillennialists had to come up with a new name for themselves to distinguish them from the dispensational premillennialists. And so people thought, well, what should we call the more historic version of premillennialism? And you'll never guess what they came up with. They called it historic premillennialism, or sometimes it's referred to as post-tribulational premillennialism. I hope I'm not losing you here. I know this is a lot of information, but I promise if you just study the timelines and think about the meaning of each of the terms, this will start to make sense and you'll be better able to navigate it for yourself. So with all that said, final thoughts for now. Faithful Christians have disagreed about the nature and timing of the millennium, and therefore it should not be a test of orthodoxy. As we're going to see really soon, good arguments can be made for and against all of these views, and so I really think we should extend grace to one another when we differ with one another on this. The millennium is a secondary issue at best, and I don't think it should be a cause for division. And if you watch this far into the video, I'll share a couple of my own personal thoughts about these views. Amillennialism is the simplest view, and I love its emphasis on the present kingship of Christ. Now, that's not to say that the other views don't believe in the present kingship of Christ, but amillennialism really emphasizes that because for them, the millennial kingdom is taking place now, today. I really love that, and of course, I like how simple it is. It's easy to understand, and it doesn't make a ton of extravagant claims for itself. But then postmillennialism is the most optimistic view, and it really encourages long-term investments in society. I love how it emphasizes the power of the gospel to change lives and transform societies. And pretty much every postmillennialist I know is deeply committed to influencing politics and arts and entertainment for the sake of Christ and his kingdom. I can tell they're really interested in investing in future generations, and I think that's a very attractive feature of postmillennialism. But then historic premillennialism has stood the test of time, and it's really easy to get from the text. We'll see that more clearly when we make our video about it, but with historic premillennialism, you don't have to do a lot of cutting and pasting. It's all packaged quite neatly there in the last few chapters of Revelation. I think that's very significant. But then dispensational premillennialism is the most exciting view, in my opinion, and I appreciate its emphasis on interpreting Scripture literally. Dispensationalists are usually very cautious against allegorizing or spiritualizing Scripture. I think that's really healthy, especially living in an age and a culture that's constantly pressuring us to abandon the authority of Scripture. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciate about that view. So which view do I personally hold? I bounced around on this issue a lot in my early years as a Christian, but I do think that since then I've more or less settled on a position. The view that I increasingly find myself convinced of is historic premillennialism. I could be wrong on that. You're more than welcome to disagree with me and maybe even try to change my mind in the comments, but that is where I lean for now. And so with that said, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful for you. And if so, please remember to subscribe if you haven't already and like the video because it really helps out the channel. And I can't wait to see you in the next video. Bye.